The Ideas Factory for the Views Function Bar and Grill in Werribee. Call Neil Mitchell now, 96900 693, or outside Melbourne, 13 13 32.
I want your ideas on being able to buy a house, things you gave up to buy a house. If you are after a house now, what do you do? And what are the ideas on what we can do to make home ownership more affordable for a generation coming through? It's interesting how one particular idea or phrase can grab attention and change the whole debate, lead a whole debate. This is such a time. This has gone around the world. Bernard Salt is a demographer with KPMG, columnist with The Weekend Australian. At the weekend, he touched on the spending habits of young people and specifically smashed avocado. And the world took off. Bernard Salt, good morning.
Hi, Neil.
What have you done?
I don't know. I don't know. I wrote what I thought was a very self-deprecating column around the ageing process, a 50-something baby boomer wandering into a hipster cafe and then parodying the middle-aged around not being able to sit on a milk crate, not being able to read the menu, not being able to make conversation because the music is too loud. It was actually, I thought, very critical of baby boomers, or poking fun at baby boomers because of their middle age.
I think I've been to the same cafe, by the way.
Yeah, they're pretty much the same, which is terrific. But then I said, I'm part of a secret society. This is what middle-aged people think when they are in those cafes. Yeah. We think, gosh, look at all these young people. How can they afford that? Shouldn't they be saving for a house? And I said, not that you would say it out loud because all hell would break loose, but this is what we think, in fact. And, of course, what has happened is on Saturday and Sunday, people got the joke and saw the context of it all. Monday morning, just 5 lines where it looks like I was admonishing Generation Y was taken out and put into social media. And then the way social media works is, well, when I want to see the context of that, here are the 5 offending lines, and off it went. I was always very confident that once people saw the entire story or read the entire column and saw it within context, they'd say, well, actually he's having a go at baby boomers and he's having a go at Generation Y. I
think I've got those 5 lines. Quote, I've seen young people order smashed avocado with crumbled feta on 5-grain toasted bread at $22 a pop and more. I can afford to eat this for lunch because I'm middle-aged and have raised my family. How can young people afford to eat like this? Shouldn't they be economising by eating at home? How often are they eating out? $22 several times a week could go towards the deposit on a house.
My point is, does that line of thinking, does that thought line occur to middle-aged people? And they would say, well, yes, it does, because when I was in my 20s, here is what I did. And I think what this debate has brought out is that in the 1980s, when baby boomers were of the same age, the argument is that home ownership was within reach, yes, within Melbourne and Sydney, and therefore, if I sacrifice a bit, I can get a home. Whereas today, the argument is, well, home ownership has got so far out of hand that it's beyond the horizon. We can't, no amount of sacrifice will actually deliver home ownership. But my observation, and I thought the humour of the piece, was that this is what occurs to baby boomers, and you dare not speak it out loud. So I don't believe that I was being openly or unfairly admonishing of Generation Y. If anything, I was poking fun at baby boomer at middle age.
How old were you when you bought your first house?
I was in my mid-20s.
Do you remember what you gave up to do it?
Well, in fact, my wife and I were living in Melbourne at the time. I'd just completing university, and I was writing a master's degree, and we wanted to renovate an old house, and we were renting in Malvern at the time. And we wanted to renovate an old house, but they were so expensive in Malvern. We actually moved to Geelong. So we moved to an inner suburb of Geelong, bought a house and renovated it and so forth. That was my story, and I'm not saying that today's millennials need to move to a provincial city.
Well, maybe they do, though. I mean, if you can't live in Brunswick with the Milk Crate Cafe. Not everybody can live there because the houses are expensive. Well, you do have to go to Diggers Rest.
Well, I do think that Melbourne has changed. Certainly Sydney has changed over the course of 30 years. We are now living in global cities, and you can look at the Chinese influence in Melbourne over the last decade or so. We are actually competing, residents of Melbourne are competing with global workers who can choose to live in Melbourne and compete up property values. If Melbourne is a global city, if Sydney is a global city, then the housing market will become as difficult to get into in those cities as it is in London, Paris, New York and Tokyo. It's a sad corollary, if you like, of admission into the global city club. Now, what we need to do as a society is to actually find ways to enable Generation Y, millennials, to get access to the housing market.
Well,
and hopefully that will come out, that's a positive that will come out of this debate.
Do we have to do that, or do we just change attitudes and say home ownership is no longer the essential part of life we thought it was?
Well, I think there is an element there of truth as well, that just putting the home affordability issue to one side for a moment, we can come back to it, but Generation Y is less predisposed, in my view, to home ownership than baby boomers. Baby boomers, they were obsessed by it.
You had to do it, yeah.
That's why, and we were an outlier in global home ownership rates in the 1950s to the 1980s. We are now converging back to global averages, similar to the US and the UK, for example. And the reality is that a 20-something living in Melbourne would say, well, I don't really want to commit to a 30-year mortgage and to Melbourne for 30 years. In 5 years' time, I might be in Sydney or London or Shanghai or Mumbai. I don't want to be anchored the way in which baby boomers were happy to be anchored 30 years ago. So there is an element there of shifting values. There is an element there of Melbourne becoming a global city. And I don't think as a society we baby boomers can say, well, it's not my problem. I think Melbourne, I think Victoria, I think Australia works better when everyone feels they can achieve what they want in life.
We'll take some calls, 96900 693 13 13 32. If you wouldn't mind putting the headphones on. Bernard Salt, demographer, KPMG. Do you make in any way a serious point that the Generation Y is indulging itself rather than making a choice on home ownership? Does it come down to that? Look, you want to buy a house. My first one, I was absolutely broke after I bought it. The second one, I hocked myself stupid and don't know how I made the repayments. But do we have to, is there a generational approach that says, no, we're not going to do it tough, we want to do it easy? No,
I actually think that Generation Y are prepared. I think if you put any generation at any time in history in the right circumstances, they'll make the sacrifices. What we need to do as a society is to put the goal of home ownership within reach. Okay, it may not be a groovy apartment in Brunswick or in Chapel Street or whatever, but it needs to be reasonable and fair. For example...
Groovy, you are a baby.
I'm not sure that that's a word anymore. But
cool.
In terms of getting access to homes, we need to actually make it within reach so that, look, if you make the right choices, if you work hard, put your head down, you actually can get there. It's not for everyone, but we need, as a society, to actually create that environment.
Hello, Ben. What do you think?
Hey, good morning, Neil. Bernard raised the point that we're dealing with the international players now that are coming in, choosing Melbourne, pricing young Melburnians out of the market. If we borrow $500,000, Neil, over the 30 years, we're going to pay back $900,000, and that just eats up far too much of our life income stream. So how about if we could get 0% interest for the duration of the loan to be able to buy homes? So when we borrow $500, we have to pay back $500, then it becomes affordable.
But who provides 0% interest? The banks would go out of business.
No, the banks can still be there for personal decisions and other people that want material items, but a home shouldn't be considered material possession. It should be considered a necessity. Everyone needs a home.
But who provides the money? Where are you getting the money at 0%?
The government has a sovereign right to be able to print currency for people. They could issue it through the Reserve Bank of Australia.
So the government prints money and gives it to people for houses at no interest, Bernard Salt?
Well, I want to stimulate debate and I want everyone's views. And I'm legitimate about this.
Yeah.
I want everyone's views, and that's the way that person thinks, that's fine. One thing I will say that I've been a little upset about in this whole process is the level of abuse that follows.
Well, you've been abused.
Well, online and so forth. What I'm encouraging people to do, when you see those five lines rattling around social media,
yes,
go to the original document, read my entire context, then make a judgment.
And this is interesting, though, Ben, raising zero interest. Well, you can get a home loan now with 4.5%, 5%. I was talking to the NAB about it the other day. You can get a mortgage loan 4.5%, 5%. I was considered lucky with my first one, which was 13.5%. People were paying 19 and 20%. Now, admittedly, inflation was running, so the house was worth a lot more, technically.
Yeah, there's a theory that every generation by middle age says we've had it tough.
I'm not saying
and
that.
every baby boomer has a story about how they did it tough and what they did to get that 19% in interest rates. And our parents in the 1960s and 70s would say, well, you lot, you hippies, have got it easy. You didn't have to fight in a war.
Yeah.
And I suspect that millennials in the 2030s and 40s will have stories also about how they did it tough.
We'll take a break. More from Bernard Salt, more of your calls, the Ideas Factory in a moment.